There is a moment on the journey south when the world begins to disappear. First, the last inhabited islands fall behind. Then regular shipping routes fade from the charts. Aircraft become rare. Weather systems grow larger, the horizon emptier, and the nearest cities can be thousands of kilometers away. Eventually, even the ocean itself seems to change character. Long swells travel beneath grey skies, with almost nothing to interrupt them. The wind can move around the planet with fewer obstacles than almost anywhere else on Earth. Ahead lies Antarctica, but long before anyone sees the continent, they have already entered one of the most unusual environments on the planet. The first sign is not necessarily ice. It may be a sudden drop in water temperature, a change in the species pulled from a scientific net, or an invisible boundary where two enormous bodies of seawater meet. There is no coastline here, no sign announcing that one ocean has ended and another has begun. Yet, something fundamental has changed. You have crossed into the Southern Ocean. For most of human history, this was the ocean at the edge of the known world. Sailors approaching it from the north encountered increasingly violent weather and enormous distances of open water. Maps became uncertain. Reports returned describing floating mountains of ice, whales appearing in numbers difficult to imagine today, seas covered in birds, and a continent that seemed to retreat behind storms whenever explorers approached it. Antarctica eventually became the famous part of the story. Its ice sheet is so vast that it contains most of the world's freshwater ice. Its mountain ranges, glaciers, and enormous ice shelves dominate almost every photograph of the region. The water surrounding it usually plays a supporting role, a dark border around something more impressive. But that is a misleading way to see Antarctica. The continent and the ocean are not two separate worlds. Much of what makes Antarctica possible begins in the water around it. Even deciding where that water begins is less straightforward than drawing a line on a map. Most oceans are divided partly by continents. Africa separates the Atlantic from the Indian Ocean. The Americas form an enormous wall between the Atlantic and Pacific. The Southern Ocean is different. Water can travel around Antarctica without encountering a continent that blocks its path. For practical mapping, 60 degrees south latitude is widely used as an approximate northern boundary, but the more interesting borders are moving ones. Oceanographers can identify fronts where temperature, salinity, and biological communities change across relatively narrow bands of ocean. Cross one of these boundaries, and the water on one side may have traveled through a different part of the global ocean from the water on the other. Species that are common farther north may suddenly become scarce. Antarctic forms begin to dominate. The border of this ocean is therefore not simply geographic. In a very real sense, it is written into the water itself. That makes the Southern Ocean difficult to think about in the same way as other seas. It surrounds a continent, but it also joins three enormous ocean basins. Waters from the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans all interact here. Beneath the apparently featureless surface are broad bands of current, deep water rising from far below, colder water moving toward the north, and dense water descending toward the abyss. Some of these water masses will eventually travel astonishing distances from Antarctica. The ocean around the world's most isolated continent is, paradoxically, one of the places where the global ocean is most thoroughly connected. From the deck of a ship, none of this is obvious. The surface can look almost empty. On difficult days, it is an endless field of dark water, white caps, and low cloud. There are no forests to reveal where biological richness begins, no coral reefs visible through clear tropical water, no great herds crossing open plains. Much of the life is hidden vertically. Some organisms remain microscopic. Others spend most of their lives beneath the surface. Some live on a seafloor kilometers below the ship. And some of the largest animals ever to exist may appear only briefly, breathing at the surface before vanishing again. Then summer arrives, and the emptiness becomes difficult to maintain as an illusion. In productive regions, phytoplankton can multiply through sunlit surface waters, converting light and dissolved nutrients into living material. Krill gather in swarms that may attract penguins, seals, seabirds, and whales. Humpbacks travel immense distances to feed here. Antarctic minke whales move among sea ice. Orcas patrol the same waters using hunting strategies that differ between populations. Beneath them are fish whose bodies have been transformed by millions of years in extreme cold. And farther down live invertebrates with forms and sizes that seem better suited to an imagined alien ocean than the one surrounding our own planet. Much of this abundance ultimately depends on brief periods when light returns strongly enough to drive biological production. The entire system breathes with the seasons. Few places on Earth change their visible size so dramatically during a single year. Each autumn, seawater begins freezing around Antarctica. Through winter, the ice spreads outward across millions of square kilometers. By late winter, it can cover roughly 18 to 20 million square kilometers of ocean. Then, as sunlight strengthens through spring and summer, much of that enormous frozen cover breaks apart and melts again, leaving only a fraction of its winter extent. It is one of the largest seasonal transformations on Earth. A region of open water becomes an ice-covered habitat and then largely returns to open water year after year. The ice does far more than change the view from above. On and within it, microscopic algae can grow. Beneath it, young krill can find both food and refuge. Seals use certain forms of ice to rest or reproduce. Penguins depend on its position and timing in different ways. The edge of the pack ice can become a moving ecological boundary where predators concentrate because their prey does too. What looks from a satellite like frozen emptiness can therefore function as habitat, nursery, hunting ground and climate system at the same time. And the animals living here have had to solve problems that almost no tropical species ever encounter. Antarctic seawater can remain liquid below 0 degrees Celsius because dissolved salt lowers its freezing point. For an animal whose internal fluids are less salty than seawater, that creates a dangerous situation. Ice crystals entering the body can become a serious threat. Some Antarctic fish lineages evolved proteins that interfere with the growth of ice crystals in their blood and tissues. One group went even further down an evolutionary path that produced vertebrates unlike almost any others alive today. Antarctic icefish include species whose blood lacks the red color we associate so strongly with vertebrate life because they no longer produce functional hemoglobin. That sounds impossible until the rest of their physiology is understood. Elsewhere on the seabed, another pattern appears. Sea spiders can grow to sizes startling compared with many of their relatives farther north. Certain amphipods and isopods also reach unusually large dimensions. Sponges can form strange, slow-growing communities across cold seafloors. Scientists have spent decades investigating why gigantism appears in some Antarctic groups, testing ideas involving oxygen, temperature, metabolism, and ecology. There is no single explanation that neatly accounts for every case. And then there is an animal that makes even those giants look small. The colossal squid is not a legend assembled from sailors' stories. Specimens exist. Its anatomy has been studied. It possesses enormous eyes and powerful arms and tentacles equipped with hooks, and it inhabits the cold Southern Ocean around Antarctica. Yet knowing that an animal exists is very different from knowing its life. Most of what humanity has learned about colossal squid has come from individuals caught accidentally, remains recovered from predators, or other indirect evidence. A healthy adult moving naturally through deep Antarctic water remains extraordinarily difficult to observe. Sperm whales descend into the same darkness and feed on large squid, leaving scientists to reconstruct interactions that almost never happen within sight of a human observer. That problem repeats throughout the Southern Ocean. We know an extraordinary amount about Antarctica compared with the explorers who first sailed south, but knowledge here is uneven. Satellites can watch sea ice across an entire hemisphere, while being unable to show us what an individual squid is doing a kilometer beneath it. Sonar can reveal the shape of the seafloor, while telling us far less about the animals moving just above it. Researchers can lower instruments into the deep ocean, but a measurement collected at one location represents an almost absurdly small point inside a body of water covering tens of millions of square kilometers. The farther south scientists go, the more difficult even ordinary work can become. Research vessels may spend days crossing violent seas simply to reach a sampling area. Sea ice can close routes. Instruments can be lost beneath moving flows. Weather can stop operations that took months to organize. Under floating ice shelves, the challenge becomes stranger still. There are marine environments where no ship can sail because hundreds of meters of ice form a permanent ceiling overhead. To investigate them, researchers may drill through the ice and send robotic vehicles into cavities humans cannot directly enter, relying on cameras and sensors traveling through darkness beneath the frozen continent's edge. This is why the Southern Ocean resists simple descriptions. Calling it cold is true but nearly meaningless. Calling it remote misses the fact that its circulation is tied to the rest of the world. Calling it barren ignores one of Earth's great marine ecosystems. Calling it unexplored exaggerates what we do not know, while understating how difficult the remaining questions actually are. We have mapped currents, tracked whales from space, measured water that will eventually spread through the deep ocean, identified bizarre evolutionary adaptations, and recovered animals that previous generations knew only from fragments. Yet almost every answer seems to reveal another scale of the system that remains harder to observe. Perhaps the most important clue is the current itself. Long before the colossal squid, before penguins, before the sea ice expanded and retreated in anything like its modern pattern, Antarctica belonged to a very different Earth. It was connected to other continents. Its climate was warmer. Forests once grew where kilometers of ice now dominate the landscape. The ocean could not yet move around it in the way it does today. To understand why the Southern Ocean became this strange, we have to begin before there was a Southern Ocean at all, when Antarctica was not an isolated white continent at the bottom of the world, but part of something much larger. Long before Antarctica became a white continent surrounded by dark water, it belonged to a world that would be almost impossible to recognize from a modern map. There was no permanent ice sheet covering the landscape, no Southern Ocean circling it in anything like its present form, and no Drake Passage separating the tip of South America from the Antarctic Peninsula. Antarctica was part of Gondwana, the enormous southern supercontinent that also included South America, Africa, India, Australia, and other fragments of land now scattered across the planet. For hundreds of millions of years, these continents shared geological and biological connections that are difficult to imagine today. Animals could inhabit regions that would eventually drift thousands of kilometers apart. Plant communities spread across landscapes now divided by entire oceans. The evidence remains locked inside Antarctic rock. Fossils of dinosaurs, amphibians, and ancient plants have been found on a continent where today almost nothing grows beyond small patches of moss, lichens, and algae. Some of the most famous fossils are leaves and wood from Glossopteris, an extinct group of seed plants whose remains occur across several former Gondwanan continents. Their distribution became one of the clues that helped scientists understand that these lands had once been joined. There is even a remarkable human detail attached to that evidence. When the bodies of Robert Falcon Scott and two of his companions were found in their tent in 1912 after their disastrous return from the South Pole, geological specimens collected during the journey were still with them. Among the material were fossils of Glossopteris. The exhausted men had abandoned equipment as their situation worsened, yet they had continued carrying geological samples whose scientific importance they understood. Those fossils were roughly 250 million years old, remnants of a world in which Antarctica supported vegetation on a scale that seems absurd when viewed against the landscape Scott died crossing. But even the forests represented by Glossopteris were only one episode in a much longer story. Antarctica remained capable of supporting substantial vegetation tens of millions of years later, including during periods when it was already positioned close to the South Pole. One of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence was recovered not from an exposed cliff, but from beneath the seabed off West Antarctica. During a scientific expedition, researchers drilled into sediment that had been buried for roughly 90 million years. What came up was so unusual that the material looked less like ordinary marine sediment and more like soil. Inside, it was an intact network of fossil roots, accompanied by pollen and spores. The roots had not simply been washed there from somewhere else. Plants had grown in that ground. The site was at a paleolatitude of about 82 degrees south, only around 900 kilometers from the South Pole, yet the evidence showed that a temperate rainforest had existed there. Reconstructions suggest a mean annual temperature of around 12 to 13 degrees Celsius, with considerably warmer summer conditions. The difficult part to picture is not simply the warmth, it is the light. A forest growing that far south still had to live with the geometry of a polar planet. Summer would bring months when the sun barely disappeared, while winter brought a long period without sunlight at all. Trees had to survive darkness on a schedule no modern tropical rainforest experiences. Yet forests did survive. Later, during the early Eocene, roughly 50 million years ago, evidence from East Antarctica indicates that coastal lowlands supported remarkably diverse forests during another extremely warm interval. Pollen and chemical traces preserved in sediments suggest vegetation including warmth-loving plants, with mild winters despite prolonged polar darkness. Even around 40 million years ago, Antarctica still contained freshwater environments capable of supporting frogs. Tiny fossil bone fragments recovered from Seymour Island near the Antarctic Peninsula record an animal whose presence tells us something surprisingly intimate about the climate. An ectothermic vertebrate had been able to live there. Antarctica, in other words, did not simply begin as an icy continent and remain that way. Its transformation required both the atmosphere above it and the geography around it to change. Gondwana had already begun breaking apart during the age of dinosaurs. Africa and South America separated. India moved north on a journey that would eventually end in collision with Asia. Australia and Antarctica remained connected much longer, but their relationship was changing too. Australia began separating from Antarctica tens of millions of years ago, initially very slowly, before its northward movement accelerated. These movements seem almost meaningless on a human timescale. Continents shifting by centimeters per year do not look like movement at all, but give those centimeters tens of millions of years and they rearrange a planet. A strip of shallow water becomes a seaway. A seaway widens into an ocean. Coastlines that once faced each other end up separated by thousands of kilometers. More importantly for Antarctica, the movement of Australia and South America gradually removed two enormous obstacles that had prevented seawater from flowing freely around the continent. To the south of Australia, a marine connection developed through what became the Tasman Gateway. On the opposite side of Antarctica, South America was pulling away from the Antarctic Peninsula. Between them lay the region we now call the Drake Passage. Today, it is an open water gap, roughly 850 kilometers wide, between Cape Horn and the Antarctic Peninsula, notorious among sailors for powerful winds and large seas. But the Drake Passage did not suddenly appear one morning in geological history. Its formation was complicated. Crust stretched and fractured. Shallow connections may have developed before deeper pathways became possible. Researchers still investigate exactly when different kinds of water could pass through and how those changes affected circulation. Geological evidence suggests that a shallow connection between the Pacific and Atlantic may have existed by the Middle Eocene, while a deeper water connection developed later, around the transition from the Eocene into the Oligocene. That timing matters because something dramatic was happening to Antarctica at approximately the same period. Earth was moving away from the exceptionally warm greenhouse conditions that had characterized earlier ages. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations were declining over the long term. Temperatures fell. Around 34 million years ago, near the boundary between the Eocene and Oligocene epochs, Antarctica underwent one of the great environmental transformations in the planet's recent geological history. Ice expanded dramatically, particularly across East Antarctica, and the continent began moving toward the frozen state we recognize today. For a long time, it was tempting to tell this as a beautifully simple chain of events. South America and Australia moved away. Ocean gateways opened. A current began circling Antarctica. Warm water from lower latitudes could no longer reach the continent as effectively. Antarctica became thermally isolated, temperatures collapsed, and the great ice sheet appeared. The real story is more interesting because it is not that neat. Scientists have spent decades trying to determine how much of Antarctica's cooling was caused by changing ocean circulation and how much was driven by falling atmospheric carbon dioxide. The opening of the Drake Passage itself was not a single switch from close to open, neither was the Tasman Gateway. Different depths became available to different water masses at different times. Some modeling studies suggest that even after deep water connections existed through these gateways, the geography around Australia may still have prevented a strong, coherent Antarctic circumpolar current from developing immediately. Antarctica's major glaciation, therefore, cannot simply be explained by saying the current formed, so the continent froze. Declining carbon dioxide was a major part of the transition, while changing gateways and circulation altered the way heat moved through the Southern Ocean. The modern system emerged from those processes, interacting over millions of years. That distinction matters because it changes how we understand the Southern Ocean. It was not created in a single geological moment. It assembled gradually as the planet itself was rearranged. And every stage of that rearrangement affected life. Before Antarctica became strongly isolated, its marine ecosystems were connected much more easily with neighboring regions. Fossil and evolutionary evidence shows links among marine animals living around Antarctica, southern South America, Australia, and New Zealand. During parts of the Cretaceous and early Cenozoic, these regions formed a broad southern marine province, in which organisms could disperse through temperate waters. If we could somehow travel back and sample those seas, the biological boundary between Antarctica and the rest of the southern world would be much less obvious than it is today. Then the connections began to weaken. The continent cooled, ice expanded, ocean temperatures declined, habitats disappeared or shifted, organisms adapted, migrated or vanished. Groups capable of surviving the increasingly cold conditions remained, while others retreated northward or became extinct locally. The ocean surrounding Antarctica became progressively more distinct from the waters beyond it. This process was not instantaneous either. Antarctica did not lose every tree the moment large ice sheets began growing. Vegetation survived in some places far longer than the simple image of a suddenly frozen continent would suggest. Fossil evidence shows that plant communities persisted after the major cooling around 34 million years ago, and recent work on West Antarctic fossils indicates that southern beach relatives were still present there during the early Miocene, millions of years after continental-scale glaciation had begun. The transition from green Antarctica to white Antarctica was therefore uneven, ice advancing, vegetation contracting, climate oscillating, and marine environments being repeatedly reorganized. But the direction was unmistakable. Antarctica was becoming colder and more isolated, while the gaps around it widened and deepened. Eventually, the geography allowed something that had been impossible when Gondwana was intact. Seawater could travel all the way around Antarctica without being stopped by a continent. That changed the geometry of the global ocean. Wind blowing persistently from west to east across the high southern latitudes could now act on an almost uninterrupted belt of water. Instead of currents being forced against a continental barrier, an immense circulation could develop around Antarctica. Water masses that once belonged to more separated basins increasingly became part of a connected system. Ocean fronts strengthened. The biological isolation of Antarctica intensified. Over geological time, the marine animals trapped inside this cooling world were subjected to evolutionary pressures unlike those experienced by their relatives farther north. The consequences are still alive today. The antifreeze molecules we will find in Antarctic fish, the peculiar physiology of ice fish, the strange communities on the seafloor, and even the ecological world inhabited by colossal squid are all, in different ways, descendants of this transformation. They make more sense once Antarctica is no longer imagined as a continent that was simply placed at the South Pole already frozen. Its modern ecosystem was built through separation. Continents had to move, gateways had to open, temperatures had to fall, ice had to expand. Populations that had once belonged to a broader southern world became increasingly confined to an ocean developing its own physical rules. And once that final pathway around Antarctica became established, isolation produced a paradox. The continent became more cut off from warm waters and biological communities to the north, yet the ocean surrounding it became part of an immense circulation connecting the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. The same system that helped make Antarctica one of Earth's most isolated environments would become one of the planet's most important routes for moving water, heat, nutrients, and carbon. To understand how that is possible, we have to leave the ancient forests behind and follow the water that now runs through the gateways they helped create. The water that now runs through those ancient gateways does not behave like a river in the sea. There are no banks containing it, no single channel that can be followed neatly around Antarctica, and no point where someone could stand above it and watch the entire current pass beneath them. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current is better imagined as an enormous moving belt of ocean, broken into twisting bands and fronts, sometimes spreading apart, sometimes squeezing together, constantly disturbed by underwater mountains, ridges, and the shape of the seafloor. Yet taken as a whole, it accomplishes something no other major ocean current can. It travels continuously around the planet. Once water enters this circulation, there is no continent directly blocking its path around Antarctica. It can move eastward from the waters south of the Atlantic into the Indian sector, continue into the Pacific, pass through the narrow gateway between South America and the Antarctic Peninsula, and arrive back where it began. The quantities involved are difficult to picture. Modern observations have estimated the eastward transport of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current at roughly 170 million cubic meters of water every second. A single cubic meter already weighs about a ton. Here, tens of millions of tons of seawater are moving through imaginary sections of ocean every second, day after day, as part of the largest current system on Earth. What keeps such an enormous body of water moving is partly written in the geography we have just watched develop. Antarctica sits alone over the South Pole, surrounded by ocean rather than a ring of neighboring continents. Above that ocean lies another moving system, the atmosphere. Between roughly 40 and 60 degrees south, strong prevailing winds blow predominantly from west to east. Sailors knew these latitudes long before oceanographers could explain them. The names given to parts of the Southern Ocean, such as the Roaring Forties and Furious Fifties, came from experience rather than equations. With relatively little land to interrupt them, weather systems and winds can travel across vast distances of open water. The surface ocean feels that force continuously. Wind transfers momentum into the sea, but the result is more complicated than simply pushing the water in the same direction. Earth's rotation deflects moving water, density differences tilt layers inside the ocean, and turbulence creates enormous swirling eddies that can be tens or even hundreds of kilometers across. The current that emerges from all of this is not a smooth blue arrow running around a globe. Satellite maps reveal something much more alive: meanders, loops, jets, and eddies woven together into a broad eastward flow. The seafloor complicates it further. Far below the waves, ridges and underwater mountains force parts of the current to turn, accelerate, and squeeze through narrower passages. Drake Passage is the most obvious bottleneck. South America and the Antarctic Peninsula approach one another closely enough that an ocean current extending around an entire planet has to pass through a gap only about 800 kilometers wide. The water is still kilometers deep in places, but compared with the enormous circumference of the Southern Ocean, this is a geological doorway. Other obstacles lie completely underwater. The Kerguelen Plateau in the Indian sector, the Pacific Antarctic Ridge, and other major features distort the current's path, producing bends and concentrating flow. Even an ocean with no continental wall around Antarctica is still being guided by rock. That helps explain why oceanographers speak about the Antarctic Circumpolar Current in terms of fronts, rather than one enormous stream. A front is a region where properties of the ocean change relatively quickly across a comparatively short distance. Sail north or south through the Southern Ocean, and the temperature does not simply decline smoothly with latitude. Different water masses meet. Their temperature, salinity, and density differ. Several major fronts wind around Antarctica, including the subantarctic front and polar front, with additional branches and boundaries farther south. They meander, they split, their exact positions move, yet they create remarkably persistent divisions in the ocean. Long before satellites could trace these features from space, sailors and naturalists could sometimes recognize that they had crossed into a different water world. Sea temperature dropped, fog appeared, different birds became common. Organisms collected from the water changed. The polar front in particular helps create one of the biological boundaries hinted at earlier in our journey south. On one side are relatively warmer subantarctic waters. On the other, colder Antarctic waters dominate. For many marine organisms, crossing such a boundary is not equivalent to swimming across an arbitrary line of latitude. Temperature affects metabolism, reproduction, and survival. Currents influence where larvae can drift. Water chemistry and food availability change. Over evolutionary time, these moving fronts have helped separate biological communities just as effectively as some physical barriers on land. Yet the same current that divides ecosystems also connects entire oceans. Water entering the Southern Ocean carries properties acquired elsewhere. Deep water formed in the North Atlantic, for example, can travel southward through the Atlantic and eventually enter the Southern Ocean. By the time it arrives, it has spent a long period away from the atmosphere. During that journey, sinking organic matter has been decomposed by microorganisms, returning nutrients and carbon to the water. The deep ocean therefore becomes a vast reservoir. In most places, getting that water back toward the surface is difficult. The ocean is strongly layered by density. Dense water prefers to remain beneath lighter water, rather like a heavy liquid sitting below a lighter one. Around Antarctica, however, the structure of the ocean and the relentless winds create one of the most important return routes in the global circulation. Deep water rises toward the surface across the Southern Ocean. Scientists call the process upwelling, but the word can make it sound like water is shooting vertically upward from the abyss. The reality is slower and larger. Water follows sloping density layers, spiraling through the Antarctic circumpolar current over immense distances as it gradually approaches the surface. Research combining observations with high-resolution models has traced deep waters entering the current along the boundaries of the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific basins before following complicated southeastward and upward pathways. A parcel of water surfacing near Antarctica may therefore carry a history that began far beyond the Southern Ocean. It may have last contacted the atmosphere decades or centuries earlier. The nutrients within it can become available again to microscopic life near the surface. The carbon it carries can exchange with the atmosphere. Some of the heat contained in deeper water can be transported toward Antarctic continental shelves and ice. What looks like a remote ring of ocean is actually one of the great junctions in the planet's circulation. This vertical movement is as important as the current's famous eastward journey. The global ocean does not simply circulate horizontally around continents. Water also sinks into the deep sea and eventually returns upward. The Southern Ocean is one of the crucial places where that return happens. Oceanographers have increasingly recognized that understanding upwelling around Antarctica is essential to understanding how heat, carbon, and nutrients move through the global ocean. The winds play a central role again. Because of Earth's rotation, their effect on the surface layers tends to move water northward, away from Antarctica, across much of the Southern Ocean. Water cannot simply leave a permanent hole behind, so deeper water is drawn upward as part of the circulation. At the same time, enormous eddies push water and heat across the current in ways that partly oppose or reshape the wind-driven movement. This is one reason the Southern Ocean is difficult to reduce to a simple conveyor belt diagram. The diagrams are useful, but the real ocean is full of competing motions. A current may carry water east while an eddy transports heat sideways. A deep water mass may gradually rise while passing through several fronts. Water approaching the surface can be transformed by rain, snowfall, sea ice formation, melting, heating and cooling. Some eventually moves northward and sinks beneath warmer subtropical waters, carrying newly acquired properties into the ocean interior. Some move south toward Antarctica and can participate in processes that ultimately produce extremely dense bottom water. The Southern Ocean is therefore not merely a roundabout through which existing water masses pass. It is a workshop in which they are changed. This also explains a strange feature of Antarctic productivity. Deep water returning toward the surface brings nutrients such as nitrate and phosphate that microscopic algae need to grow. In many parts of the world's oceans, nutrients near the sunlit surface can become scarce because phytoplankton consume them. The Southern Ocean contains enormous reservoirs of major nutrients, replenished partly through this circulation. Yet having nutrients does not automatically produce endless blooms. Much of the open Southern Ocean is limited by something present in tiny quantities: iron. Phytoplankton need only trace amounts, but in many Antarctic waters there is not enough readily available iron for them to use all the nitrate and phosphate surrounding them. This creates one of the ocean's great biological peculiarities. Water can be rich in major nutrients, while microscopic plants remain limited by a metal they require in minute concentrations. Where iron becomes more available through interactions with continental shelves, sediments, melting ice, islands, dust or other processes, productivity can rise dramatically. Physical oceanography begins turning directly into ecology. A bend in a current around an island can influence where nutrients travel. Upwelling can help feed phytoplankton. Phytoplankton feed krill. Krill feed penguins, seals and whales. An underwater ridge that no animal at the surface can see may ultimately influence where predators gather hundreds or thousands of meters above it. South Georgia provides a remarkable example. The island sits in the path of the Antarctic circumpolar current, and the current's fronts and interactions with the surrounding topography help shape an exceptionally productive marine ecosystem. Studies around the island have shown how strongly physical fronts and biological habitats can overlap. The same principle operates on scales far larger than any one island. Water carries not only heat and salt, but the conditions from which ecosystems emerge. This is why calling the Antarctic circumpolar current simply the world's largest current undersells it. Its importance is not found only in how much water passes through Drake Passage. The current allows exchanges between the Atlantic, Indian and Pacific Oceans. Its fronts help organize habitats. Its winds and density structure participate in bringing ancient deep water back toward the surface. Its eddies transport heat across boundaries. It influences where nutrients become available, how carbon moves between atmosphere and ocean, and how much relatively warm deep water can approach parts of Antarctica. And there is still another twist in its history. The opening of ocean gateways tens of millions of years ago made circumpolar flow possible. But recent geological research suggests that the strong, deep-reaching Antarctic circumpolar current, resembling the modern system, may have developed much later than the first opening of Drake Passage and the Tasman Gateway. Evidence from marine sediments indicates that a vigorous modern-like current may not have become established until roughly the last 14 million years. As Antarctic ice and sea ice expanded, density contrasts strengthened, and southern hemisphere westerly winds intensified. The current was not simply switched on when South America moved away. Like Antarctica itself, it evolved. Geography provided the pathway. Climate, winds, ice, density and seafloor topography helped shape the system moving through it. That interaction continues every second. Above, winds race around the high southern latitudes. Below, the largest current system on Earth carries water eastward. Within it, deep water slowly rises. Fronts twist around the continent, and eddies pull heat across them. Far beneath, mountains on the seafloor steer flows no human can see from the surface. And closer to Antarctica, some of that moving ocean encounters the one substance that transforms almost every part of the world ahead of us. As temperatures fall toward the freezing point of seawater, the open surface begins to change. Small crystals appear. They collide, accumulate, and freeze together. The boundary between atmosphere and ocean becomes solid in places, then spreads outward until an area larger than Antarctica itself can be covered by seasonal sea ice. The current keeps moving beneath it, but from this point onward, the story of the Southern Ocean can no longer be told through water alone. At the surface, that transformation begins almost invisibly. The temperature of seawater falls toward about -1.8 degrees Celsius, its freezing point lowered below zero by the salt dissolved within it. The first ice does not usually appear as a solid white sheet. Tiny crystals begin forming in the upper ocean, creating a loose suspension known as fragile ice. In calm conditions, they can freeze together. In rougher water, they collide and accumulate into rounded discs called pancake ice, their edges repeatedly pushed against one another by waves. Given enough cold, these fragments join into larger flows. Snow settles on top. Cracks open and freeze again. Wind pushes the ice together in one place and pulls it apart somewhere else. Over weeks, what had been open ocean becomes a shifting mosaic of white, blue, and black, constantly moving above the water we have just followed around Antarctica. The scale of this transformation is enormous. Around the end of the Antarctic summer, roughly 2.5 million square kilometers of sea ice remain on average. By the end of winter, the average is closer to 18.5 million. That means an area of ocean comparable in size to South America can become ice-covered during the seasonal expansion, only for most of that ice to disappear again as summer returns. Unlike much of the Arctic, Antarctic sea ice has an open northern boundary. Flows can drift away from the continent into warmer water, and most of the ice formed during one winter does not survive the following summer. The Southern Ocean effectively builds an enormous temporary habitat each year and then dismantles much of it. From a satellite, the process looks almost clean, white spreading outward during autumn and winter, then retreating toward the continent through spring and summer. At the scale of an animal, it is anything but clean. Sea ice is broken, rafted, flooded, compressed, and fractured. Leads open between flows, exposing narrow strips of black water. In some places, persistent areas of open water called polyneus remain surrounded by ice. Elsewhere, wind piles flows together. The ice itself drifts, sometimes carrying organisms with it over considerable distances. A habitat that appears solid from space is actually one of the most restless landscapes in Antarctica. Even its internal structure is surprisingly complicated, because seawater does something important when it freezes. The growing ice crystals do not neatly incorporate all the salt around them. Much of that salt is rejected into the surrounding water, while some becomes concentrated in tiny pockets and channels of liquid brine trapped within the ice. New sea ice can therefore contain a network of microscopic spaces filled with extremely salty water. As the temperature changes, those spaces change too. Channels widen or contract. Brine drains downward. The water immediately beneath newly forming ice can become saltier and denser as salt is expelled. What appears to us as a simple slab of frozen seawater is, at microscopic scale, a porous environment containing liquid pathways. And those pathways are inhabited. Bacteria, archaea, microscopic algae and other organisms live in association with Antarctic sea ice, surviving combinations of cold, salinity, and changing light that would be hostile to many forms of life. Some algae become concentrated within brine channels. Others grow particularly strongly near the bottom of the ice, where there is access to seawater below. By spring, the underside of a floe can develop a brownish or greenish layer that looks almost like dirt until it is examined closely. Much of the color comes from photosynthetic organisms. The ice has become a garden. For months, however, that garden has to endure one of Antarctica's defining rhythms. As winter deepens, the sun disappears for increasingly long periods at high latitudes. At the South Pole itself, There is effectively one sunrise and one sunset each year, separated by months of continuous daylight and months of darkness. Across the wider Southern Ocean, the exact pattern varies with latitude, but everywhere the seasonal difference is severe. Photosynthetic organisms cannot simply continue producing at summer rates through the polar night. Growth slows, communities shift. Some organisms draw on stored energy or exploit other sources of organic material. Then spring changes the equation. Light returns while nutrients remain available, and microscopic production can accelerate. The timing matters. Life here is not simply adapted to cold. Much of it is adapted to a world where opportunity arrives in pulses. A creature may spend months surviving poor conditions so that it is ready when light, food, and open water return together. Few animals illustrate this better than Antarctic krill. Later, krill will become one of the central characters in this story because so much of the Southern Ocean's visible wildlife ultimately depends on them. But their connection with the ice begins long before a whale opens its mouth around a swarm. An adult Antarctic krill is only several centimeters long, yet its life cycle involves a vertical journey through an ocean that can be kilometers deep. During summer, females can release thousands of eggs at a time near the surface. Those eggs sink. They may descend hundreds of meters, sometimes approaching depths around a kilometer, while developing. They hatch below, and the young stages then begin moving back upward through the water column. By the time they reach the surface world, survival is tied to a landscape that will soon be transformed by winter. Young krill do not experience sea ice as an obstacle above them. They can use it as cover. Larvae and juveniles occupy the complex underside of flows, where ridges, cavities, and rough ice provide a three-dimensional habitat. Ice-associated algae can provide food, although research has complicated the older idea that winter sea ice is simply an enormous krill feeding ground everywhere. Observations from winter expeditions have shown that some pack ice regions contain relatively little food, while the physical shelter provided by the ice can still be extremely valuable. Young krill hiding beneath it may reduce their exposure to predators, and drifting flows can transport them through the Southern Ocean toward areas that become more productive later. The relationship is therefore richer than krill eat ice algae. The ice can be pantry, shelter, and moving habitat, with the importance of each role changing according to location and season. When spring arrives, the system begins releasing what winter stored. Increasing sunlight penetrates the ice. Algae grow more rapidly. Melting eventually frees ice-associated algae and other organic material into surface waters, helping connect the frozen habitat with the open ocean around it. Phytoplankton blooms can develop where light and physical conditions are favorable. Krill feed. Fish feed on krill and other organisms. Penguins and seals exploit the concentrations of prey. Baleen whales that have traveled thousands of kilometers can arrive in Antarctic feeding grounds at the season when enormous amounts of energy are passing upward through the food web. The spectacular animals above the surface are therefore responding to processes that may have begun months earlier inside a layer of ice only a meter or two thick. The ice also changes how predators and prey move through the world. A Weddell seal living near fast ice needs openings through which it can breathe, and it can maintain breathing holes by repeatedly scraping them with its teeth. Emperor penguins depend on stable sea ice for breeding, enduring winter conditions while the ocean remains hidden beneath their feet. Antarctic minke whales can move through pack ice and use cracks and openings to reach the atmosphere. Leopard seals patrol ice edges where penguins and other prey enter the water. The boundary between frozen and liquid ocean becomes an ecological landscape with its own corridors, refuges, and ambush points. What matters to an animal is not merely how many square kilometers of sea ice exist, but where that ice is, when it forms, how thick it becomes, whether it is attached to the coast or drifting, how fractured it is, and when it disappears. This is why 2 years with superficially similar amounts of ice can still produce very different local conditions for wildlife. Wind can push ice away from a coast or compress it against one. Snow can alter how much light reaches algae below. Ocean waves can break flows into smaller pieces, exposing more edges to relatively warm water. Recent research has even shown that waves washing across floes can remove snow and flood their surfaces, contributing to summer melting while creating temporary watery environments where algae can grow rapidly. The supposedly rigid boundary between ocean and ice is constantly being renegotiated. There is another consequence occurring during freezing that reaches far beyond the organisms attached to a floe. As sea ice forms and salt is rejected, the water beneath can become denser. In certain Antarctic coastal regions, repeated freezing contributes to the production of very cold, salty water, dense enough to sink. Combined with other processes, this helps create some of the densest water in the global ocean, water that can spill from the continental shelf and descend into the abyss. So even the seasonal creation of ice at the surface can become connected to circulation thousands of meters below. The microscopic and planetary scales keep meeting here. A brine channel can contain algae. Salt escaping from ice can alter seawater density. Dense water can sink into the deep ocean. The same freezing process can influence a krill larva centimeters long and a water mass eventually spreading far beyond Antarctica. Yet the most immediate challenge is simpler. This environment is dangerously cold. Seawater remains liquid at temperatures below the point at which freshwater freezes. For many marine animals, especially those whose body fluids have a higher freezing point than the ocean surrounding them, that creates a problem that cannot be solved by behavior alone. A fish cannot simply leave the cold for a few hours and return when conditions improve. Some Antarctic species spend their entire lives in water hovering near -1.8 degrees Celsius. Ice crystals can exist around them. In certain circumstances, microscopic crystals can enter through the gills, wounds, or digestive system. Once inside body fluids that are vulnerable to freezing, a crystal can provide the starting point from which more ice grows. The danger is not that the fish suddenly becomes a solid block of ice in dramatic fashion. The danger begins at the molecular scale, where one crystal can become a template for another. This posed an extraordinary evolutionary problem. The ancestors of modern Antarctic fish entered a world growing colder over millions of years, until ordinary vertebrate physiology was being pushed toward a physical limit. They could migrate away, disappear, or somehow prevent ice from growing inside them. Some lineages remained. Their descendants swim beneath Antarctic ice today because evolution produced a solution so effective that scientists eventually found part of it circulating in the animal's blood. Specialized antifreeze molecules able to interfere with ice crystals before those crystals could become lethal. And once evolution began reshaping Antarctic fish for this almost permanently cold ocean, antifreeze would turn out to be only the beginning. The antifreeze circulating through these fish is not antifreeze in the way the word is normally used. It does not warm the animal, and it does not simply lower the freezing point of every fluid in the body by adding some chemical equivalent of salt. Antarctic notothenoid fishes produce specialized antifreeze glycoproteins that interact with tiny ice crystals. When a crystal enters the body, these molecules attach to its surface and interfere with the addition of more water molecules to the growing ice lattice. The crystal can remain present without being allowed to grow freely. That distinction is the difference between carrying microscopic ice and having that ice spread through tissues where it could become lethal. It is an elegant solution to a problem created by the peculiar physics of Antarctic seawater. The body fluids of an ordinary marine fish would begin freezing at a higher temperature than the surrounding seawater, which can remain liquid near -1.9 degrees Celsius. Without protection, the ocean itself can therefore be cold enough to freeze the animal living inside it. For Antarctic notothenoids, antifreeze glycoproteins help close that dangerous gap. What makes the story more remarkable is where this ability came from. Evolution did not invent a completely new gene from nothing. Researchers comparing the DNA responsible for antifreeze glycoproteins with other genes discovered molecular fingerprints linking it to trypsinogen, the precursor of a digestive enzyme produced in the pancreas. Parts of that ancestral gene were recruited, while a tiny section of DNA was repeated again and again until it encoded the characteristic repeating structure of the antifreeze molecule. A gene associated with digestion had, through mutation, duplication and natural selection, helped produce something with an entirely different job, preventing ice crystals from growing inside a fish. The connection is almost unusually neat for evolutionary biology. The Antarctic environment was cooling toward the freezing conditions that made antifreeze increasingly valuable, and the lineage possessing this molecular innovation gained access to habitats that were becoming lethal to fishes without comparable protection. Notothonioids subsequently underwent an extraordinary radiation through Antarctic waters. Today they account for a dominant share of the fish fauna around the continent, occupying ecological roles that elsewhere would be divided among many unrelated groups. Some live close to the bottom, others moved into the water column. Some became predators. The Antarctic toothfish can grow into a large, powerful animal, inhabiting deep and extremely cold water. Yet these different forms are variations on an evolutionary story, shaped by the same environmental filter: survive the cold first, and only then can everything else happen. Cold, however, changes far more than whether body fluids freeze. Chemistry slows as temperature falls. Proteins must still fold correctly, and enzymes must still perform reactions. Cell membranes, which contain fats that can become more rigid in the cold, have to remain functional. Nerves must transmit signals. Muscles have to contract. Digestion, growth, and reproduction all continue in an environment where the molecular machinery of life is being asked to work near the freezing point of seawater. Antarctic ectotherms have evolved adjustments at many of these levels, including changes to enzymes, membranes, and metabolic organization. Their lives often proceed at a pace very different from that of relatives in warmer seas. Growth and development can be slow. Eggs may take long periods to develop. Some species are exceptionally specialized for a narrow range of low temperatures. That specialization is important because adaptation is easy to misunderstand when we look at an animal perfectly matched to an extreme environment. It can appear as though evolution has steadily improved the organism until it became tougher than everything else. In reality, specialization can make an animal extraordinarily successful under one set of conditions, while leaving it with fewer options when those conditions change. A fish whose proteins, membranes, metabolism, and oxygen delivery systems have been shaped for millions of years in consistently cold water does not necessarily become a fish capable of surviving anything. It may become a fish capable of surviving Antarctica. Experiments and physiological studies on Antarctic ectotherms have repeatedly shown how narrow thermal specialization can come with limited capacity when temperatures rise. The cold is not merely something these animals tolerate. It has become built into the way their bodies work, and nowhere is the strange logic of this specialization more obvious than in a family of fishes whose appearance once seemed to violate one of the basic rules of vertebrate biology. In the late 1920s, the Norwegian zoologist Ditlev Rustad was working in Antarctic waters during a whaling expedition when he encountered an unusual fish. Whalers were already familiar with pale, almost translucent fishes from the region, but what made these animals extraordinary became apparent when their circulatory system was examined. Their blood was not red. Decades later, Norwegian physiologist Johan Ruud investigated the phenomenon in detail and in 1954 published a paper with a title that captured exactly how strange the discovery appeared. These were vertebrates without erythrocytes and blood pigment. The animals we now call crocodile ice fishes had lost functional hemoglobin. In almost every vertebrate familiar to us, hemoglobin is so fundamental that imagining blood without it sounds like imagining lungs without air. Oxygen entering the bloodstream does not dissolve efficiently enough in plasma to satisfy the needs of most active vertebrate bodies. Red blood cells solve the problem by packing enormous quantities of hemoglobin, whose molecules bind oxygen and carry it from respiratory surfaces to tissues. Human blood owes its red color largely to the iron-containing heme groups in hemoglobin. Remove the red cells and their pigment, and the oxygen-carrying capacity collapses. Yet adult Antarctic ice fishes do exactly that. Their blood is pale because circulating red blood cells and functional hemoglobin are absent. They are the only known vertebrates in which this condition characterizes an entire living family. The first part of the explanation lies in the same cold water that created so many other problems. Gases dissolve more readily in cold water than warm water, so the frigid Southern Ocean is naturally rich in dissolved oxygen. Icefish also tend to have relatively low metabolic demands, compared with highly active fishes from warmer environments. Under these unusual circumstances, oxygen carried simply in solution within blood plasma can contribute more than it could in a warm water fish. But that does not make hemoglobin unnecessary. Plasma alone carries only a fraction of the oxygen that hemoglobin-rich blood can transport. Losing hemoglobin created a serious physiological disadvantage, and the icefish body carries the evidence of the compensation required to survive it. Their hearts are unusually large. Their blood volume is greater than in comparable red-blooded Antarctic fishes. Their blood vessels are wider, and dense networks of capillaries help move oxygen toward tissues. The heart functions as a high-volume pump, moving large amounts of thin blood at relatively low pressure. Compared with red-blooded notothenioids of similar size, some measurements show icefish producing several times the cardiac output. Removing red blood cells also makes their blood less viscous, which helps it flow more easily. But the cardiovascular system still has to work hard to compensate for the enormous loss in oxygen-carrying capacity. Even inside their cells, the architecture is unusual. Icefish muscles and hearts can contain extremely high densities of mitochondria, the structures where aerobic energy production occurs. More mitochondrial membrane may help oxygen diffuse through tissue over shorter distances, effectively changing the internal landscape through which oxygen must travel. Some icefish species have gone further still and lost the expression of myoglobin in the heart. Myoglobin is another oxygen-binding protein, normally important within muscle cells. The losses did not happen identically across the entire family. Some icefish retain cardiac myoglobin while others do not, providing scientists with a remarkable natural comparison for studying what these proteins actually contribute. It would be tempting to describe the disappearance of hemoglobin as another brilliant Antarctic adaptation, as though evolution deliberately removed something unnecessary and replaced it with a cleverer system. The evidence points to a messier story. Physiologists studying icefish have argued that the loss of hemoglobin itself is not an advantage. Circulating enough oxygen without it carries substantial energetic costs, and losing myoglobin can reduce cardiac performance. The large hearts, expanded blood volumes, wide vessels, and dense capillary networks are better understood as compensations that allow the fish to survive a disadvantage that became tolerable only because Antarctic water is so cold and oxygen-rich. That is evolution in a form rarely shown in simple nature stories. Natural selection does not design organisms from scratch. It works with whatever mutations occur in bodies already carrying the history of everything that came before. A trait can be lost because environmental conditions make that loss survivable. Other parts of the body can then change around it. What eventually emerges may look beautifully coordinated, but the path toward it can involve accidents, compromises, and expensive repairs. The icefish is not a perfectly engineered vertebrate that discovered a better way to transport oxygen. It is an animal living close to a physiological edge and surviving because an entire suite of features makes that edge possible. There is another cost hidden in that success. The environmental conditions that once allowed such extreme specialization may also make these fishes vulnerable when the environment moves away from what their bodies expect. Cold water holds more oxygen than warm water. As temperature rises, oxygen becomes less soluble, while the metabolic demands of an ectothermic animal generally increase. For a fish already transporting oxygen without hemoglobin, that combination can be especially challenging. Icefish can increase cardiovascular performance to a degree, but their unusual system does not possess unlimited capacity. What worked across long periods of stable Antarctic cold becomes a constraint when the temperature changes. The same principle extends beyond icefish. Antarctic marine animals often reveal evolution not as a collection of spectacular tricks, but as a record of negotiations with an environment. Antifreeze prevents one catastrophe while creating its own physiological complexities. Slow metabolism reduces energy demand, but can mean slow growth and development. Specialization makes survival possible in conditions that exclude competitors, yet can narrow the range of conditions an organism handles well. The Southern Ocean did not simply produce animals that became progressively more extreme. It removed possibilities. Lineages unable to tolerate the changing conditions disappeared or retreated. Those that remained explored the biological space left behind, sometimes losing features that would be indispensable elsewhere, and sometimes evolving new ones that exist because nowhere else presented exactly the same problem. This is one reason notothenoids became so important to Antarctic ecosystems. As cooling transformed the Southern Ocean and many fish groups declined, the survivors diversified into ecological opportunities that opened around them. The result is an ocean where a relatively unusual evolutionary radiation supplies much of the fish diversity and biomass that predators encounter. Penguins, seals, larger fish, and other hunters therefore participate in a food web shaped by evolutionary events millions of years old. The antifreeze molecule inside a small fish and the feeding behavior of a seal above it belong to the same history. But cold water had another property that would lead Antarctic biology in a different direction. The oxygen-rich conditions that helped make hemoglobin loss survivable also became part of a much broader scientific puzzle. On the seafloor, researchers encountered animals whose bodies were not merely chemically unusual. Some were much larger than relatives elsewhere. Sea spiders with leg spans approaching the size of a dinner plate moved across Antarctic bottoms. Amphipods that in many places would be tiny could become conspicuously large. Isopods, sponges, and other invertebrates contributed to a pattern noticed again and again in polar waters. Not every Antarctic animal became a giant, and not every lineage follows the same rule. That is precisely what makes the pattern interesting. If cold, oxygen-rich water could help a vertebrate survive without red blood, scientists began asking what else those conditions might allow bodies to do. The pattern becomes obvious only when Antarctica is compared with the rest of the ocean. Sea spiders exist almost everywhere, from shallow coastlines to the deep sea, and most are small enough to disappear among rocks and weeds. But on the Antarctic seafloor, some species stretch more than half a meter from leg tip to leg tip. Their bodies remain strangely narrow, almost as if an ordinary animal has been pulled outward until it becomes mostly legs. Amphipods show a similar surprise. In many seas, they are tiny crustaceans that could sit comfortably on a fingertip. Around Antarctica, some species reach several centimeters, and the largest forms are dramatically bigger than the familiar animals found along temperate shores. Large isopods occur here too, while enormous sponges rise from parts of the seabed, like slow-growing structures rather than animals. This tendency for some polar marine groups to contain unusually large species became known as polar gigantism, and for years one explanation seemed almost too perfect. It began with oxygen. Cold seawater can hold more dissolved oxygen than warm seawater. At the same time, most Antarctic invertebrates are ectotherms, meaning their body temperature follows the environment around them. At temperatures hovering near the freezing point, their metabolism can be extremely slow. Put those two conditions together, and Antarctica appears to offer an unusual bargain. Plenty of oxygen available in the water, while the animal itself requires relatively little of it. That matters, because becoming larger creates a problem. As a body increases in size, the amount of tissue requiring oxygen grows rapidly, while the surface available to absorb that oxygen does not increase at the same rate. Eventually, supply can struggle to keep pace with demand. In warm water, where metabolism is faster and less oxygen can remain dissolved, that limit may arrive sooner. In the cold Southern Ocean, perhaps animals could simply grow beyond it. Studies of amphipods seem to support the idea. Across different environments, the maximum sizes reached by these crustaceans appeared to increase where more oxygen was potentially available. Suddenly, Antarctica's giants seemed to make sense. But the explanation became less comfortable when researchers began testing actual animals rather than comparing patterns on maps. Sea spiders were especially useful because their respiratory system is wonderfully strange. They have no lungs and no conventional gills. Oxygen passes directly through their outer covering, and even their circulation is unusual. Their digestive system extends down their long legs, and movements of the gut help move fluids through the body. If large Antarctic sea spiders existed because abundant oxygen allowed them to overcome the limitations of this simple system, then reducing the oxygen around them should expose the weakness. The largest animals ought to struggle first. Scientists collected sea spiders from McMurdo Sound, ranging across an enormous span of body sizes, and placed them in water containing different amounts of oxygen. To measure performance, they used a test that was simple but revealing. Turn a sea spider onto its back and see how often it can right itself. Under low oxygen, the animals performed worse. That part made sense. But the giants did not fail disproportionately compared with smaller species. Large size alone did not create the vulnerability the straightforward oxygen theory predicted. Researchers later approached the question from another direction by warming the water. Warmer conditions should increase an ectotherm's metabolic demand while making oxygen harder to obtain. Again, if gigantism depended on the unusual generosity of freezing, oxygen-rich seawater, the largest sea spiders should reach their limits first. The animals certainly noticed the heat. Antarctic species that have evolved for millions of years in remarkably stable cold can be extremely sensitive to temperatures that would seem harmless elsewhere. Yet once again, size did not produce the clean pattern scientists expected. Part of the answer turned out to be written into the spiders themselves. As some sea spiders grow larger, their outer covering becomes more porous. Oxygen can pass through that surface more effectively, helping compensate for the longer distances and greater demands created by a larger body. The giant is therefore not simply a small sea spider enlarged like an image on a screen. Its respiratory surface changes as the animal grows. Oxygen was still part of the story, but the animal had changed the rules. Amphipods complicated matters in another way. Experiments on several Antarctic species found that larger animals could indeed be more sensitive when oxygen levels declined, giving some support to the original idea. But species mattered too. An active, medium-sized amphipod could outperform what body size alone predicted, because its respiratory machinery was better suited to delivering oxygen. Some crustaceans possess oxygen-carrying pigments and specialized gas exchange structures that sea spiders lack. Two animals living in the same cold water can therefore face completely different limits. This is where polar gigantism stops being a simple Antarctic curiosity and becomes a much more interesting evolutionary puzzle. There may not be one reason Antarctica produces giants. Cold can lower metabolic costs. Oxygen availability can relax constraints for certain animals. Slow growth can allow some species to reach large sizes over long lives. Food supply, predation, competition, and the evolutionary history of each group can all change what is possible. And crucially, most Antarctic animals are not giants. Tiny organisms live beside the enormous ones under exactly the same water. If cold and oxygen automatically made animals large, almost everything on the seabed should be oversized. Instead, gigantism appears in particular branches of life whose bodies were capable of taking advantage of Antarctic conditions. Sponges show how different the route can be. They do not chase prey or pump blood through muscles. Water moves through their bodies, bringing oxygen and suspended food. Some Antarctic sponges grow very slowly and can form substantial structures on the seafloor, creating habitat used by other organisms. Here, large size may emerge through an entirely different combination of low metabolism, long life, environmental stability, and the ability to continue adding tissue over years or decades. A large sponge, a giant amphipod, and a sea spider may look like examples of the same Antarctic rule, while actually arriving at size through different biological pathways. There is something important in that uncertainty. Nature documentaries often present evolution after the mystery has already been solved. A strange animal appears, One explanation is given, and the problem seems finished. Real science rarely behaves so neatly. The oxygen hypothesis was attractive because it made a clear prediction. Scientists tested that prediction, found that it worked better for some animals than others, and discovered new details about how those animals functioned in the process. The failure of one simple explanation revealed a more complicated and more interesting Antarctic world. It also exposed the same trade-off we encountered in the icefish. These giants have evolved within an environment that has remained extremely cold for an immense span of time. Warm that environment and metabolism rises. Warmer water also holds less oxygen. An animal whose entire respiratory system has been shaped around Antarctic conditions may suddenly face a combination its ancestors rarely encountered. Being enormous is not necessarily an advantage then. The conditions that made unusual body sizes possible can become the conditions those bodies depend upon. Yet even the largest of these creatures remains a giant only by comparison with its relatives. A sea spider spanning half a meter is astonishing because most sea spiders are tiny. An oversized amphipod is extraordinary because its relatives are usually measured in centimeters. Somewhere beyond the seafloor, however, the Southern Ocean produces an invertebrate that requires no comparison to seem enormous. It can outweigh several adult humans. Its eyes are larger than those of almost any animal known. Along its limbs are hooks capable of rotating as they grip. Sperm whales descend into the same deep Antarctic water in search of prey, and some return carrying marks that hint at what happens in darkness far below the surface. For much of modern science, pieces of this animal were easier to find inside whales than the animal itself. And even after entire specimens finally reached scientists, one of the largest invertebrates on Earth remained an animal whose normal life almost nobody had actually seen. For almost exactly a century, the colossal squid occupied an unusual position in science. We knew the animal was real, but nobody had confirmed seeing one alive in the place where it actually lived. Its existence was first recognized from material recovered from a sperm whale in the 1920s. That beginning was strangely appropriate. Again and again, the best evidence for one of the largest invertebrates on Earth would come not from watching the squid itself, but from the animals capable of finding it in the dark. Even its name can cause confusion. The colossal squid is not simply an exceptionally large giant squid. Giant squid belong to the genus Architeuthis and have long, slender bodies and extremely elongated tentacles. The colossal squid, Mesonicoteuthis hamiltoni, belongs to a different family. It is shorter and heavier, with a much more massive mantle. A giant squid may win on total length, but the colossal squid is the heavyweight. The largest well-studied specimen weighed close to half a ton. Its body plan is also armed in a way that immediately separates it from its famous cousin. Along the ends of its two feeding tentacles are rows of hooks capable of swiveling within the flesh. Its 8 shorter arms carry hooks and suckers as well. These are not decorative structures. In deep Antarctic water, they form a gripping system for prey that cannot easily be allowed a second chance. Antarctic toothfish are among the animals colossal squid are thought to take, and we have seen a glimpse of how determined that attack can be. In February 2007, a New Zealand fishing vessel was hauling a longline from the Ross Sea when something enormous came up with it. About 1,500 meters below the surface, a colossal squid had attacked a toothfish caught on the line. Instead of releasing the fish as it was hauled upward, the squid remained attached. Eventually, both arrived at the surface. The squid was badly injured and could not be returned alive, but the crew recognized what they had encountered. Getting it aboard took considerable effort. Frozen soon afterward, it was eventually transferred to scientists in New Zealand, where it became the most famous specimen of its species. Once properly examined, the female measured about 4.2 meters in total length and weighed roughly 495 kilograms before adjustments for ice and preservation. Earlier estimates had expected something much longer, which revealed another problem with studying soft-bodied animals recovered from deep water. Squid stretch, contract, shrink, and become damaged after death. Measuring one is not as straightforward as laying a whale skeleton on the floor. The specimen's mass was more revealing. This was an animal built thick rather than impossibly long. Its eyes were extraordinary. Colossal squid possess the largest known eyes of any living animal, reaching roughly the size of a football in large specimens. In the deep ocean, where sunlight disappears, an eye that large may seem pointless. But darkness is not complete emptiness. Many deep-sea animals produce bioluminescence, and researchers have proposed that enormous eyes could be especially useful for detecting large objects, disturbing glowing organisms at a distance. One particularly important object would be a sperm whale. A whale descending through the darkness displaces water and may trigger flashes from organisms around it, potentially giving a colossal squid warning that something enormous is approaching. We cannot yet watch an adult colossal squid and confirm exactly how it uses those eyes. That is the recurring problem with almost everything about this animal. Anatomy gives clues, predators provide evidence. Much of the behavior has to be reconstructed. Even the squid's size contains uncertainty. Hard beaks survive digestion far better than soft tissue, and colossal squid beaks found inside sperm whales have sometimes been larger than those belonging to the famous half-ton specimen. That suggests larger individuals exist, but converting a beak into an exact body weight is difficult because scientists possess so few large intact specimens for comparison. The temptation is to turn that uncertainty into a mythical one-ton monster. The more accurate, and more interesting, answer is that we genuinely do not yet know the upper limit. The sperm whale is one reason we know the squid reaches impressive sizes at all. Adult male sperm whales travel into high southern latitudes and dive repeatedly into deep water in search of squid and fish. They can remain submerged for well over half an hour, using powerful echolocation clicks to search a world where vision rapidly becomes useless. In Antarctic recordings, scientists have heard these whales clicking through long foraging dives, effectively listening to predators searching a habitat humans cannot follow with comparable freedom. When whales die or strand and their stomach contents are examined, squid beaks remain after the soft bodies have disappeared. Some of those beaks belong unmistakably to colossal squid. In certain Southern Ocean studies, colossal squid have represented a substantial part of the prey consumed by sperm whales. The whale therefore becomes an unlikely sampling instrument, descending hundreds or thousands of meters, locating animals researchers struggle to find, eating them, and returning evidence to the surface. Marks on sperm whales have often been associated with encounters with large squid as well, although scars alone cannot reliably tell us exactly which squid species caused them. It is easy to imagine a dramatic battle between two giants, but that image can outrun the evidence. A sperm whale is vastly heavier than even the largest known colossal squid. The squid's hooks may injure a predator attempting to capture it, but this is primarily a relationship between predator and prey, not two evenly matched monsters fighting for control of the abyss. The reality is more compelling because it is ecological. Somewhere in Antarctic darkness, a mammal that breathes air leaves the surface, follows sound into the deep, finds a squid humans almost never encounter, consumes it, and resurfaces. We infer parts of the meeting from what remains afterward. Then, in March 2025, something happened that changed this story. A remotely operated vehicle was working near the South Sandwich Islands at a depth of about 600 meters when its cameras recorded a transparent squid only around 30 centimeters long. Experts examining the footage confirmed it as a juvenile Mesonychoteuthis hamiltoni. 100 years after the species had been formally described, humanity finally had confirmed footage of a colossal squid alive in its natural environment. And the first one we truly saw was not colossal at all. It was a baby. The animal drifted before the cameras almost ghost-like, its body still transparent, the future giant reduced to a delicate form suspended in dark water. That single observation captures how incomplete our relationship with this species remains. We have hauled a female weighing hundreds of kilograms from the Ross Sea. We have dissected enormous eyes, examined rotating hooks and measured beaks. We have found larger beaks inside sperm whales and used them to infer animals we have never recovered. We can listen acoustically as whales search the same depths. Yet the first confirmed living colossal squid, filmed in its own habitat, was a juvenile, small enough to hold in 2 hands. No confirmed footage yet shows a mature giant moving naturally through the deep Southern Ocean. We do not know precisely how active adults are, how often they hunt, how they reproduce, how they encounter mates, how they behave around sperm whales, or exactly how large the biggest individuals become. Even basic parts of their life are assembled from fragments because collecting a dead animal and observing a living one are completely different kinds of knowledge. To understand the adult properly, a camera would have to enter its world without waiting for the squid to become trapped on a fishing line or swallowed by a whale. It would have to descend beyond the bright surface, through cold water where daylight weakens into blue and then disappears, across an Antarctic Ocean whose greatest living spaces are not spread horizontally before us, but stacked vertically beneath our feet. And the farther down we follow it, the less familiar that ocean becomes. Following a colossal squid into its own world means leaving behind almost everything that makes the ocean familiar. The first 100 meters can still belong to sunlight. Below that, colors begin disappearing one by one. Red goes first, then orange and yellow, until the water becomes overwhelmingly blue. Continue downward, and even that fades. By around 1,000 meters, sunlight is effectively gone. The ocean has not become empty. Only our ability to see it has disappeared. Above, Antarctica is defined by ice, wind, and an enormous white horizon. Down here, there is no horizon at all. There is only water, darkness, and eventually a seafloor that is far stranger than the flat bottom people often imagine beneath an ocean. Even the edge of Antarctica is unusual. Around most continents, the continental shelf slopes gently away from shore before dropping into the deep ocean, and its outer edge is often found at roughly 100 to 200 meters. Antarctica's shelf averages much deeper, around 500 meters, with parts extending beyond 800. The reason is sitting directly above it. For millions of years, enormous glaciers and ice sheets have pressed down on the continent and repeatedly moved across its margins. Ice has carved troughs into the seabed, transported sediment, and reshaped entire underwater landscapes. At times when the Antarctic ice sheet expanded farther than it does today, glaciers extended across areas now submerged beneath hundreds of meters of water. The modern seafloor still carries their scars. There are broad valleys, ridges, and deep channels cut into the continental shelf, some leading towards submarine canyons that descend along the continental slope. These canyons are more than geological decoration. They can become pathways through which water, sediment, and organic material move between the shelf and the deep ocean. In places, dense Antarctic water formed near the coast can descend through them. Material produced in the bright surface ocean can also be funneled downward, linking an ecosystem powered by sunlight to animals living permanently beyond its reach. Eventually, the slope falls toward depths of 3 kilometers and more, before giving way to abyssal plains that may lie 4 or 5 kilometers beneath the surface. At those depths, the pressure is hundreds of times greater than at sea level. The temperature remains close to freezing. There are no plants because there is no sunlight to support photosynthesis. Yet when cameras finally reach the bottom, the landscape is not necessarily barren. In some places, the first thing visible is mud. Vast areas of the Antarctic seabed are covered by soft sediment, sand, gravel, and fine particles accumulating slowly over time. It looks unremarkable until the camera gets close. A sea cucumber moves across the surface. Brittle stars spread their arms. Worms disappear into burrows. Amphipods search for food. Sea urchins move through the sediment itself, consuming material buried within it. Other animals build tubes and wait for edible particles to pass overhead. Much of the community can be hidden completely beneath what initially appears to be an empty patch of seafloor. Elsewhere, the scene changes abruptly. Sponges rise above the bottom, some forming large structures that provide surfaces and shelter for smaller animals. Sea stars move among them. Feather stars extend delicate arms into the current. Corals, bryozoans, and sea squirts can turn hard surfaces into crowded living structures. In some Antarctic shelf sediments, researchers have recorded astonishing densities of small benthic animals, well over 100,000 individuals in a single square meter. The frozen continent above may support almost no complex terrestrial ecosystem at all, while the seabed immediately offshore can be packed with animals. Their energy ultimately has to come from somewhere, and much of it begins far overhead. Phytoplankton grow in the sunlit surface ocean. Krill and other animals consume them. Organisms die, produce waste, shed material, and leave fragments behind. Slowly, this organic debris sinks. Seen in the beam of a deep-sea camera or submersible, the particles resemble snow falling through black water. Marine snow can descend for days or weeks, being eaten and recycled repeatedly on its way down. Only a fraction of the material produced near the surface reaches great depth, which makes every usable piece valuable. A dead fish, a sinking carcass, or a sudden pulse of phytoplankton remains can become an event on a seafloor where food may normally arrive grain by grain. Antarctic submarine canyons have even surprised researchers with accumulations of diatoms, microscopic algae that lived near the surface before sinking and gathering far below. The connection between surface and abyss is therefore not steady. Food can arrive in pulses, and currents can concentrate it in particular places. Two sites separated by only a short distance may support completely different communities because one receives more organic material, experiences stronger currents, or contains hard surfaces where sponges and corals can attach. Scientists saw this vividly during surveys of East Antarctica. Cameras sent down before trawling sometimes revealed little more than a flat, muddy plain. Then another location produced a complex habitat crowded with sponges, corals, sea stars, crustaceans, and other invertebrates. Along a rugged canyon system near the edge of the continental shelf, researchers damaged trawl nets trying to sample difficult terrain, but recovered an extraordinary variety of animals from depths approaching 1,500 meters. At another site around 800 meters deep, cold water corals and sponges formed a reef-like habitat supporting fish and mobile invertebrates. Only a few tens of kilometers away, the community could look completely different. This is one reason a map of depth alone tells us so little about the Antarctic seabed. A canyon wall, a muddy plain, and a rocky ridge can all exist at similar depths while supporting very different lives, and some environments operate on an entirely different source of energy. In parts of the deep ocean where hydrothermal activity occurs, seawater circulates through hot rock beneath the seabed and returns carrying dissolved chemicals. Microorganisms can use chemical energy rather than sunlight to produce organic matter, supporting communities that ultimately depend on processes inside the Earth. Hydrothermal vents discovered along the East Scotia Ridge revealed Antarctic deep-sea ecosystems containing animals adapted to these chemically unusual habitats. They are reminders that even beneath an ocean dominated at the surface by ice and seasonal sunlight, some communities can be powered from below. But every time a camera reveals a scene like this, it creates a dangerous illusion that seeing means understanding. A research vessel may lower a trawl across the seabed and recover hundreds of organisms, including species that scientists struggle to identify immediately. That tells us what entered the net. It does not tell us everything that lived around it, how common those species are beyond the sampled strip, or what was small or fragile enough to escape or be destroyed during collection. A camera solves some of those problems but creates others. Its lights illuminate only a narrow window in an environment extending far beyond the frame. Animals hidden in sediment remain invisible. Fast-moving species may avoid the equipment. Sonar can map an entire canyon beautifully while telling us almost nothing about which sponge grows on one particular wall. Even discovering a new species does not mean its life is understood. Scientists may possess several preserved individuals without knowing how long they live, how far they move, what eats them, when they reproduce, or whether the species occupies one isolated canyon or thousands of kilometers of Antarctic seabed. The problem becomes almost mathematical. The Southern Ocean covers an immense area. A camera traveling a few kilometers above the bottom can collect hours of valuable footage and still have observed a vanishingly small fraction of it. A trawl may sample a strip measured in hundreds of meters from an ecosystem stretching around an entire continent. Each expedition fills in pieces, but the pieces are scattered, and Antarctica makes collecting every one of them unusually difficult. Before a camera can reveal the seabed, a ship has to reach the right coordinates. Before an instrument can measure the abyss, it has to survive the journey down and come back. Sea ice can block the route, weather can stop work for days. Equipment worth enormous amounts of money can disappear into water several kilometers deep. Research teams may travel halfway around the world for a short window in which the ocean allows them to work. We have technology capable of photographing animals in complete darkness, mapping mountains beneath kilometers of water, and recording a whale's dive into the abyss. What we do not have is unlimited access to the place where all of those things happen. The difficulty is not that we lack machines capable of entering the Antarctic Ocean. The difficulty is getting those machines to the right place, keeping them alive long enough to collect useful information, and recovering what they have seen. A research expedition can begin thousands of kilometers from its target. Ships leaving Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, or South America may spend days simply crossing open ocean before scientific work properly begins. Then comes the Southern Ocean itself. The powerful winds that drive its circulation also build some of the largest waves encountered by research vessels anywhere on Earth. Storms can force a ship to abandon delicate operations. Equipment cannot always be lowered safely when several tons of steel are rising and falling with the deck. A station planned months in advance may have to be skipped because sea ice has moved across the route. Even in summer, when daylight can last almost continuously, Antarctica decides where a ship can go. In winter, the problem becomes far greater. Darkness expands, temperatures fall, and sea ice spreads across millions of square kilometers. Ordinary vessels cannot simply push through it. Even icebreakers have limits. Sea ice is not a fixed roadblock drawn neatly on a chart. Wind and currents move it. Flows can compress together until a passage that was open hours earlier becomes impassable. Leads can appear elsewhere just as quickly. Satellites help crews see the larger pattern, but the ice immediately around a ship is still constantly changing. And every day spent forcing a route through it consumes fuel, time, and part of an expedition that may already have cost millions to organize. Reaching the water is only the beginning. Imagine trying to place an instrument on a seafloor 4 kilometers below the ship. The descent itself can take hours. Pressure increases by roughly 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of depth, so by 4,000 meters, the equipment must withstand pressures around 400 times those at the surface. A tiny weakness in a housing or seal can destroy electronics instantly. Cables can fail, batteries lose performance in extreme cold. Acoustic communication through water is slow and limited compared with the effortless wireless connections we use on land. GPS signals do not penetrate seawater, so once a vehicle dives, it has to navigate using other systems. If something goes wrong beneath several kilometers of ocean, there is no repair crew coming to meet it. This is why Antarctic exploration uses many different kinds of machines rather than one perfect vehicle. A remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, remains connected to the ship by a cable, allowing researchers to control it and receive imagery in real time. It can carry cameras, lights, and sampling tools, but the cable itself becomes a limitation. An autonomous underwater vehicle can travel without that tether, following a programmed route and mapping areas a ship cannot directly survey. But once it disappears beneath the surface, scientists may have to wait until it returns before knowing exactly what it encountered. Gliders use remarkably little energy by repeatedly changing their buoyancy, sinking and rising while their wings convert that vertical motion into forward travel. They can remain at sea for long periods, slowly building profiles of temperature, salinity, oxygen, and other properties. Floats go farther into the background. They drift through the ocean, periodically descending and resurfacing, collecting measurements that have transformed our understanding of circulation. Moorings are anchored in one place and can record conditions through seasons when no research ship is nearby. Sonar maps terrain in darkness. Satellites watch the surface from hundreds of kilometers above. Each instrument sees a different Antarctic Ocean. None sees all of it. That becomes especially obvious when the subject being studied can move. A temperature sensor can remain exactly where scientists leave it. A whale does not, neither does a seal, penguin, squid, or school of fish. A research ship can spend weeks surveying an area only for the animals it hopes to observe to be somewhere else. Even when wildlife is found, the ship itself can change what happens around it. Engines produce noise. Lights alter darkness. A camera records only what passes through its narrow field of view. The colossal squid makes this problem extreme. An animal may inhabit a vast volume of deep water, yet a camera can illuminate only a tiny piece of that volume at any moment. Scientists eventually found an ingenious solution to part of this problem. Instead of building another machine to travel through Antarctic water, they began attaching instruments to animals already perfectly equipped to do it. Southern elephant seals are extraordinary oceanographers. They spend months at sea and repeatedly dive hundreds of meters, with some dives extending well beyond a kilometer. They travel beneath weather that would stop a ship and into regions covered by sea ice. A small satellite-linked instrument attached to the fur on a seal's head can measure temperature and salinity as the animal dives. When the seal returns to the surface to breathe, part of the stored information can be transmitted to satellites. The animal then dives again, effectively producing vertical profiles of an ocean humans might otherwise fail to sample for months. The tags are designed to fall away when the seals naturally molt. The result is one of the strangest partnerships in modern oceanography. Scientists receive measurements from places their ships cannot reliably reach, because a seal happened to swim through them while looking for food. These animal-borne instruments have filled major gaps in observations around Antarctica, especially during winter and beneath seasonal sea ice. They have helped reveal pathways of warm water toward ice shelves, properties of deep and coastal water masses, and conditions in regions where conventional measurements were extremely sparse. The seal is not deliberately collecting data, of course. It is simply living its life. But that is exactly what makes it useful. The animal goes where its biology tells it to go, rather than where a research vessel can safely travel. There is something almost humbling about this. Humanity can build satellites capable of observing the entire Antarctic ice cover in a single day, autonomous vehicles that navigate underwater without pilots, and pressure housings that survive kilometers beneath the surface. Yet a seal weighing several hundred kilograms can still collect measurements from places that defeat some of our most expensive ships. Even then, the picture remains incomplete. A tagged seal samples the route the seal chooses. A float follows the current carrying it. A mooring records one location. A satellite usually measures properties of the surface or infers what lies below. A sonar map can show the shape of a canyon without revealing how the animals inside it behave. Exploration becomes an exercise in combining incomplete views. Scientists take ship measurements, satellite observations, autonomous instruments, animal tags and computer models, and try to reconstruct the moving system connecting them. The gaps are not signs that nothing is known. They are a consequence of scale. The Southern Ocean covers tens of millions of square kilometers and extends kilometers downward. Even thousands of instruments become sparse when distributed through a volume that large. And there is one region where many of these methods encounter a barrier they cannot simply work around. Satellites cannot see through hundreds of meters of solid ice. Research ships cannot sail beneath an ice shelf attached to the continent. A conventional float that rises to transmit its position may instead strike an ice ceiling. An autonomous vehicle can travel underneath, but if navigation fails, there may be no way to recover it. Along much of Antarctica, enormous glaciers flow from land onto the ocean and begin floating, forming ice shelves that can extend tens or hundreds of kilometers beyond the coastline. Beneath them is seawater, moving, circulating, carrying heat, interacting with the base of the ice, and reaching environments that have never seen direct sunlight. In some places, The distance between open ocean and the hidden cavity beneath an ice shelf is greater than the distance across entire cities. To reach it from above, scientists may have to establish a camp on the ice, drill a hole through hundreds of meters of frozen material, lower instruments into black water, and trust machines to explore a space no human being can physically follow. After everything the Southern Ocean has already made difficult, this is where exploration becomes something else entirely. Along the edge of Antarctica, there are places where the coastline does not really end at the coastline. Glaciers flow off the continent and continue outward over the sea, forming enormous floating platforms of ice. From above, an ice shelf can look like an extension of the frozen land. From below, it is something completely different, the roof of a hidden ocean. Seawater can extend tens or even hundreds of kilometers beneath these shelves, circulating through cavities sealed beneath ice that may be hundreds of meters thick. There is no daylight, no open surface, and no ordinary way for a ship to enter. Yet the water underneath is moving. It carries salt and heat, flows across the seabed, meets fresh water, released from melting ice, and eventually returns toward the open ocean. The boundary between glacier and sea is therefore not a fixed wall. It is an active environment where two enormous systems meet, and nowhere has that become more important than beneath Thwaites Glacier in West Antarctica. Thwaites is vast, roughly comparable in area to Florida or Great Britain, but its importance comes from what lies behind it. Much of the ice farther inland rests on bedrock below sea level. Near the coast, the glacier eventually reaches a point where the ice stops resting on the seabed and begins to float. This is the grounding line, and its position matters enormously. If warm ocean water melts enough ice from below and the grounding line retreats inland, the glacier can lose part of the resistance that slows its movement toward the sea. The problem was that scientists understood surprisingly little about what was actually happening at that boundary, because the most important observations had to be made underneath the ice itself. During the 2019 to 2020 Antarctic summer, an international team traveled to the eastern side of Thwaites and established a field camp above the floating ice. Simply reaching the site required an expedition across one of the most remote parts of Antarctica. Then they had to create an entrance to the ocean. Using hot water, the team melted a narrow borehole through nearly 600 meters of ice. Imagine drilling downward through a skyscraper made entirely of frozen water, knowing that the target is not rock beneath it, but a layer of seawater only a few dozen meters deep in places. Once the hole finally reached the cavity, instruments could be lowered through it to measure temperature, salinity, and currents. But a vertical hole provides only a vertical view. To understand the landscape underneath Thwaites, researchers needed something that could leave the borehole and travel sideways. That machine was IceFin. It is a long, slender underwater robot designed specifically for environments where access is extremely limited. Lowered through the borehole, it entered water that no diver could follow it into. Above the vehicle was hundreds of meters of glacier. Beneath it lay the seafloor. Ahead was the grounding zone, where the floating shelf descended toward the point at which the glacier met the bed again. Over several missions, IceFin traveled kilometers beneath the ice, carrying cameras and instruments capable of measuring temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, and currents, while mapping the shape of the ice ceiling and seabed around it. What it found immediately complicated one of the simplest assumptions about ice shelves. There was warm water beneath Thwaites, warm only by Antarctic standards, but substantially above the local freezing point. It seemed reasonable to expect that wherever this water touched the glacier, melting would be intense. Instead, the flat underside of the ice was melting more slowly than many models had expected. The reason was hidden in a thin layer of water immediately beneath it. Fresh meltwater is less dense than salty seawater, so it can form a stable layer against the ice base. Currents in the cavity were also relatively weak. Together, these conditions limited the amount of warmer water that could mix upward and deliver heat directly to flat sections of ice. Having heat in the cavity was not the same as efficiently delivering that heat to the glacier. Then IceFin reached cracks, steep surfaces and strange formations researchers described as terraces. Here the picture changed. Crevasses cut upward into the ice. Their walls provided sloping and near-vertical surfaces where water could circulate differently. Melting was much stronger along these features. Some crevasses were being widened from within as heat and salt reached their walls more effectively. The underside of Thwaites was not melting like an ice cube placed evenly in warm water. Its geometry controlled where the ocean could attack it most efficiently. A relatively flat area might resist rapid melting, while a nearby crack was being enlarged. For scientists trying to predict the future of a glacier, that difference matters. A model that treats the underside as one smooth surface can miss the very structures where some of the most important melting occurs. The robot also provided something numbers alone cannot: images. Its lights swept across an ice ceiling, sculpted into terraces, channels, and crevasses. At other moments, the camera faced downward towards sediment on the seabed. The cavity was not simply an empty gap separating ice from rock. It was a physical landscape with circulation occurring through it, shaped simultaneously by the ocean below and the glacier above. And Thwaites is only one version of this hidden world. Beneath the Filchner-Ronne ice shelf on the other side of Antarctica, researchers once drilled through roughly 900 meters of ice while conducting a geological survey. Their target was sediment on the seafloor. The site was about 260 kilometers from open water, beneath complete darkness, in seawater around -2 degrees Celsius. When a camera was lowered through the borehole, it encountered a boulder. That was inconvenient for the sediment sampling, but the images revealed something far more surprising attached to the rock. There were stationary animals living there, including sponge-like organisms and other forms that researchers could not immediately identify. The discovery challenged expectations because these animals were living enormously far from the nearest obvious source of fresh food. They could not swim toward a seasonal phytoplankton bloom. Sunlight had never reached their habitat. Whatever fed them had to arrive through currents traveling beneath the ice shelf, perhaps carrying microscopic organisms or organic material from distant productive waters. The accidental encounter raised more questions than it answered. How old were the animals? How quickly did they grow? What exactly were they eating? How widespread were communities like this beneath Antarctic ice shelves? A borehole only reveals an almost absurdly small piece of the environment below. Move the hole by a kilometer, and the camera might see something completely different. This is also where an important distinction becomes necessary. Antarctica contains liquid water beneath grounded ice as well, including subglacial lakes buried beneath kilometers of the ice sheet. Those environments are scientifically extraordinary, but they are not the same thing as the seawater cavities beneath floating ice shelves. A subglacial lake can be isolated beneath ice resting on the continent. An ice shelf cavity is part of the ocean, connected, sometimes through long and complicated pathways, to the Southern Ocean outside. Mixing the two together creates a more dramatic mystery, but it hides the more interesting reality. Antarctica contains several fundamentally different aquatic worlds beneath its ice. In the ocean cavities, water can enter from the continental shelf, carry heat toward the glacier, become altered by melting, and then flow outward again. Meltwater from one region can influence conditions somewhere else. Changes in sea ice and winds beyond the shelf can alter circulation beneath a roof that seems completely separated from the atmosphere. The hidden ocean is not isolated simply because we cannot see it. It remains connected to everything outside. That connection is what makes these cavities so important and so difficult to understand. A robot can travel a few kilometers beneath an ice shelf and transform our understanding of how it melts, yet that journey still represents a narrow line through an enormous unseen space. A borehole can reveal animals hundreds of kilometers from daylight, while leaving almost everything beyond the camera untouched. We have finally learned how to put instruments into these places, but access remains so difficult that every successful expedition feels less like completing a map than opening another window. And through those windows, one pattern keeps returning. Whether beneath seasonal sea ice, on the abyssal floor, or under a glacier hundreds of meters thick, Antarctic life ultimately depends on connections. Water moving, nutrients traveling, organic material sinking, prey gathering, and predators following. To understand how all of these hidden environments belong to one functioning ocean, we have to return from beneath the ice to something far smaller, more numerous, and more important to the Southern Ocean than almost any giant we have encountered so far. What connects the hidden communities beneath the ice, the strange fish of the continental shelf, the penguins at the surface, and some of the largest animals ever to live, is something that can fit easily in the palm of a hand. Antarctic krill are small shrimp-like crustaceans, usually only a few centimeters long. Seen individually, there is nothing about them that suggests they could help support an ecosystem containing seals, squid, penguins, and 100-ton whales. Their importance appears only when the individual disappears into the swarm. Antarctic krill can gather in enormous concentrations, sometimes containing thousands of animals within a single cubic meter of water. A swarm can stretch across kilometers, forming a moving patch of life dense enough to attract predators from above, below, and sometimes from thousands of kilometers away. But the energy inside those swarms begins with something smaller still. During the Antarctic spring and summer, returning sunlight allows phytoplankton to multiply wherever conditions are right. These microscopic organisms use sunlight to build organic matter, capturing energy at the base of the food web. Krill graze on them, filtering tiny cells from the water with specialized feeding structures. In productive areas, this transfers an enormous amount of energy from microscopic plants into bodies large enough for predators to capture. The relationship sounds simple until winter arrives. Adult krill can survive long periods of poor food availability, reducing their metabolism and drawing on stored reserves. Young krill face a more dangerous problem. Their first winter arrives while they are still small and vulnerable, and much of the open water phytoplankton production has collapsed. This is where the sea ice we encountered earlier becomes part of the story again. Algae can grow within and beneath it, providing an important winter food source, while the complex underside of the ice creates shelter. Juvenile krill can scrape algae from this frozen habitat and occupy spaces where exposure to some predators may be reduced. Their survival during these early stages can influence how many animals eventually join the great swarms of later years. Even the timing of ice formation and retreat can therefore echo upward through the food web. Krill themselves are not passive particles waiting to be eaten. They migrate vertically through the ocean, often moving between deeper water and the surface over daily cycles. They can feed, avoid predators, and respond to changing light. Swarms form, divide and move. Currents transport them, while the animals also swim within those currents. A predator arriving at the wrong place may find almost nothing, move a short distance, and the water can suddenly be filled with prey. This patchiness is one reason Antarctic feeding grounds can become so intense. The ocean does not distribute food evenly, it concentrates it. Penguins exploit those concentrations by entering the water from above. Adelie, chinstrap, gentoo, and emperor penguins use different habitats and hunting strategies, but krill are crucial prey for several Antarctic and subantarctic species. A penguin pursuing a swarm becomes a completely different animal from the awkward bird seen walking across ice. Wings have become flippers. Dense bones reduce buoyancy. The body becomes streamlined, and powerful strokes drive it through the water while it chases individual prey. Around colonies, adults may repeat these journeys constantly during the breeding season, leaving chicks behind while traveling out to feeding grounds and returning with food. A change in where krill concentrate can therefore alter how far a parent has to travel before it can feed its young. Above them, seabirds exploit the same seasonal pulse from the air and surface. Below them, fish consume krill and are themselves eaten by larger fish, seals, penguins, and squid. The food web quickly stops resembling a simple ladder. Krill can pass directly into the stomach of a whale, or their energy can move through fish and squid before reaching another predator. One of the strangest examples is an animal whose name suggests almost the opposite of what it eats. The craybeater seal is among the most abundant large mammals in the Southern Ocean, yet crabs are not the foundation of its diet. It is a specialist krill hunter, its teeth fit together in an intricate pattern, forming a sieve. The seal takes krill-filled water into its mouth, closes its jaws and forces water outward while trapping the crustaceans inside. Instead of chasing one fish at a time, it can process concentrations of tiny prey efficiently. Leopard seals use the same ecosystem very differently. They are famous for hunting penguins, but many also consume substantial amounts of krill, particularly depending on season, age, and location. The same predator capable of killing a bird at the edge of the ice can feed on crustaceans only centimeters long. Then come the whales. Humpbacks, Antarctic minke whales, fin whales and blue whales travel into Southern Ocean feeding grounds to exploit the extraordinary summer productivity. For a blue whale, the arithmetic seems almost impossible. An Antarctic blue whale can weigh well over 100 tons, yet much of the fuel maintaining that body comes from krill. The solution is not larger prey, it is concentration. A blue whale accelerates toward a dense swarm and opens an enormous mouth. Pleated grooves along the throat expand, allowing the mouth to engulf a volume of krill-filled seawater that can approach or exceed the whale's own body volume in the largest lunges. The jaws close, water is forced outward through baleen plates, and the krill remain. A single lunge can capture an extraordinary amount of prey when a swarm is sufficiently dense. This feeding strategy is energetically expensive, which is why finding the right swarm matters. The whale is not simply swimming through Antarctica with its mouth open. It is searching for concentrations valuable enough to justify the effort of engulfing them. Humpbacks can use different strategies, maneuvering through patches of krill and sometimes coordinating their movements. Antarctic minke whales are particularly comfortable around sea ice and can exploit prey in places larger whales may use differently. Orcas enter the same system as adaptable hunters capable of targeting fish, seals, penguins, and other cetaceans depending on the population and its learned hunting traditions. Sperm whales largely occupy another branch of the food web, diving for squid and fish, rather than grazing directly on krill, yet even they remain connected indirectly to productivity, beginning much closer to the surface. This is what makes krill more important than simply being abundant food. They shorten the distance between the microscopic and the enormous. In many marine ecosystems, energy passes through numerous intermediate animals before reaching the largest predators. Around Antarctica, a blue whale can effectively connect phytoplankton to one of the largest bodies evolution has ever produced, with krill occupying the crucial step between them. The relationship also runs in the opposite direction. Whales do not merely remove krill. By feeding at depth and releasing nutrient-rich waste nearer the surface, they can help recycle elements such as iron that phytoplankton need. Krill themselves contribute to carbon movement when their waste pellets and other organic materials sink. Some carbon is consumed again on the way down, some reaches deeper water. The animals in the food web are therefore also participating in the chemistry of the ocean that supports them. Every summer, this network intensifies as light returns, phytoplankton bloom, and predators converge on productive waters. Then winter reorganizes it. Whales leave or shift their ranges, sea ice expands. Penguins and seals respond according to their own life cycles. Krill survive beneath and around the ice, waiting for the next pulse. It has happened across generations, long enough for entire species to evolve around Antarctic abundance. But the enormous concentrations of krill that attract whales, seals, and penguins are visible to another predator as well. Unlike every animal that arrived before it, this one can calculate how much krill exists, build ships specifically to find the densest swarms, process enormous catches at sea, and sell what it removes from the ecosystem thousands of kilometers away. Humans did not enter the Southern Ocean food web because Antarctica changed us. We entered because we discovered there was something here worth taking. Long before humans understood what the Southern Ocean was doing to the planet, they experienced it as an obstacle. Sailors moving into high southern latitudes encountered a world in which familiar rules seemed to weaken. Westerly winds could build enormous seas across thousands of kilometers of uninterrupted ocean. Fog concealed ice, weather changed quickly, and wooden ships had no satellite forecast telling them what was coming over the horizon. The farther south they pushed, the more floating ice appeared, until navigation became a negotiation between ambition and survival. Captain James Cook demonstrated this brutally well in the 1770s. During his second voyage, Cook became the first known navigator to cross the Antarctic Circle, eventually doing so several times. He sailed farther south than anyone reliably recorded before him, but Antarctica remained hidden behind weather, distance, and ice. Cook concluded that if a southern continent existed, much of it must lie in conditions so hostile that reaching it would offer little reward. History almost immediately proved how badly humans can underestimate the value they will later assign to a remote place. The first great reason to return was not geography, it was animals. Sealers began pushing into newly discovered southern islands and Antarctic waters, where they found wildlife that had experienced little sustained human hunting. Fur seals were especially valuable because their pelts could be sold into international markets. The results were devastatingly efficient. At places such as South Georgia and the South Shetland Islands, hunters killed enormous numbers of seals within remarkably short periods. Beaches that had supported dense colonies could be stripped until the industry undermined itself. When one population became difficult to find, ships moved elsewhere. The Southern Ocean had changed in human imagination. It was no longer simply something dangerous to cross. It was a warehouse, and its isolation had preserved resources that industrial societies elsewhere wanted. Whaling expanded that idea to a far greater scale. By the early 20th century, new technology transformed what could be hunted. Steam-powered catcher boats were faster than sailing vessels. Explosive harpoons allowed crews to kill whales that earlier whalers struggled to capture. Factory ships eventually made it possible to process animals at sea rather than remain tied to shore stations. Antarctica's great seasonal gatherings of whales, built around the krill swarms we have just followed, became targets. Blue whales, fin whales, humpbacks, and other species arrived in southern feeding grounds because millions of years of ocean circulation and productivity had concentrated food there. Humans learned to concentrate ships in the same places. South Georgia became one of the centers of this industry. Whaling stations processed carcasses on a scale difficult to reconcile with the sight of the abandoned buildings that remain today. A whale could be reduced to oil and other products with industrial speed. The largest animals in Earth's history became units of production. Antarctic blue whales suffered particularly catastrophic losses. Hundreds of thousands were killed across the southern hemisphere during industrial whaling, and their Antarctic populations were reduced to a tiny fraction of their former abundance. As the larger species became scarce, fleets increasingly targeted smaller whales. The pattern resembled what sealers had done a century earlier, except with ships, explosives, and processing systems capable of operating across a much larger ocean. Yet some of the vessels entering Antarctic waters for exploitation were also collecting information. Whalers recorded where animals occurred. Expeditions charted coastlines and measured depths. Scientists sometimes worked aboard ships whose primary purpose was commercial. The boundary between extraction and discovery was uncomfortable but real. Even the famous heroic age expeditions depended on an expanding understanding of the ocean. Ernest Shackleton's Imperial Transantarctic Expedition became one of the clearest demonstrations that technology still did not equal control. In 1915, his ship Endurance became trapped in pack ice in the Weddell Sea. The crew could do almost nothing except drift with it. For months, the ship moved wherever the ice carried it until pressure finally crushed the hull. Shackleton had intended Endurance to deliver men for a crossing of Antarctica. Instead, the Southern Ocean turned the vessel itself into an experiment in helplessness. The crew survived, but only after an extraordinary sequence of journeys over ice and open water. Shackleton and 5 companions eventually crossed roughly 1,300 kilometers of the world's most dangerous ocean in the small boat James Caird to reach South Georgia. The episode is remembered as a story of leadership and survival, but it also reveals something fundamental about this ocean. humans could arrive with one of the strongest wooden ships of the period and still become passengers of moving sea ice. The following decades changed the purpose of many Antarctic voyages. Sonar replaced lead lines for mapping depth. Oceanographic instruments began measuring temperature and salinity through the water column. Icebreakers extended access. Research stations allowed scientists to remain on the continent year-round. Satellites eventually made it possible to watch sea ice expand and retreat from space. Autonomous floats, gliders, and the animal-borne sensors we encountered earlier began filling gaps ships could not reach. Each generation arrived with technology that made the previous one look primitive, and each discovered another layer of complexity. Commercial interest never disappeared. Fishing fleets began targeting Antarctic species including toothfish, large predators that occupy cold, deep waters around the continent. Their slow growth and late maturity make them very different resources from fast reproducing fish in warmer seas. Krill fisheries developed too. Modern vessels can locate dense swarms acoustically and harvest enormous quantities of animals that once seemed commercially inaccessible. Krill is used in products ranging from aquaculture feed to supplements, placing humans directly into the food web that supports penguins, seals, and whales. That created an unusually difficult management problem. Catching krill is not simply a question of whether enough krill remain across the entire Southern Ocean. Location matters. Removing prey near a penguin colony during the breeding season is ecologically different from removing the same quantity somewhere predators are less concentrated. A whale, penguin, and fishing vessel can all be searching for the same swarm, but only one of them can decide to move thousands of tons of catch through a global market. This history helped produce one of the world's most unusual systems of international marine management. The Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources was established in 1982, not merely to regulate individual target species, but with an ecosystem approach written into its purpose. Fisheries are managed while considering relationships among harvested species, dependent predators, and the wider Antarctic system. It is an ambitious idea because the ecosystem itself refuses to stay constant. Krill distribution changes with sea ice, currents, and productivity. Whale populations are recovering unevenly from historical exploitation. Fishing technology improves, climate conditions shift. Illegal and unreported fishing has created additional challenges, particularly around valuable toothfish. Conservation here is not a moment when humanity finally solved the problem. It is an ongoing attempt to manage an ocean while still discovering how it functions. That is perhaps the strangest change in our relationship with Antarctica. Cook approached the south trying to determine whether a continent existed. Sealers followed animals into unknown waters because they could be sold. Whalers learned where biological abundance gathered and nearly erased some of its greatest predators. Explorers treated the ocean as something to survive. Scientists began measuring it. International agreements increasingly treated its ecosystems as something that could be damaged and therefore had to be understood. At every stage, humans believed they had learned enough to use the Southern Ocean more effectively, and every stage revealed how incomplete that understanding was. The measurements eventually exposed the largest mistake of all. We had treated Antarctica as remote because it is difficult for us to reach. On a human map, the Southern Ocean sits at the bottom, surrounding a continent with no permanent cities and separated from most people by thousands of kilometers. But the ocean itself does not recognize that remoteness. Water rising around Antarctica can carry nutrients and carbon acquired far away. Deep water formed near the continent can spread northward into other ocean basins. Heat entering the Southern Ocean can reach Antarctic ice. Carbon dioxide released from a factory, vehicle, or power station thousands of kilometers away can eventually be absorbed into these waters. What happens here does not remain here. The same current that made Antarctica biologically isolated helped turn its surrounding ocean into a connection between the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. And once scientists began calculating what that connection meant for heat and carbon, the Southern Ocean stopped looking like the edge of the world at all. The most important discovery humans made about the Southern Ocean was not an animal, a current, or a hidden landscape beneath the ice. It was the realization that this remote ocean is not remote in the way we once imagined. The water surrounding Antarctica is woven into a circulation that reaches almost every major ocean basin on Earth. Some deep water arrives from far to the north and rises toward the Antarctic surface. Other water becomes colder and denser near the continent, sinks, and begins a journey in the opposite direction. Antarctic bottom water is the most dramatic example. It forms when extremely cold, salty, dense water, produced around parts of Antarctica, spills from the continental margins into the deep ocean. Once there, it spreads northward along the abyss, carrying oxygen and other properties into some of the deepest parts of the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. A parcel of water transformed beside Antarctica can eventually travel thousands of kilometers from the continent that created it. At the same time, deep water arriving from elsewhere rises through the Southern Ocean, bringing nutrients and carbon accumulated during its long isolation from the atmosphere. Some of that water reaches the surface and exchanges gases with the air again. Some is transformed and returned to the ocean interior. The result is not a conveyor belt moving neatly along one fixed track, but an immense three-dimensional circulation linking surface, deep ocean and atmosphere across timescales ranging from seasons to centuries. This is why the upwelling we encountered earlier matters far beyond Antarctica. Nutrients brought upward in the Southern Ocean do not all remain there. Some are transported northward and eventually help support biological productivity elsewhere. Oxygen absorbed near the surface can be carried into the interior. Heat is redistributed. Carbon dioxide moves between atmosphere and seawater, while phytoplankton converts some carbon into organic matter. Krill eat that phytoplankton. Whales, fish, and penguins eat the krill. Waste and dead material sink. Some is consumed again before reaching great depth, while some carbon is carried farther into the ocean, where it may remain separated from the atmosphere for decades or longer. The strange food web we followed is therefore part of the planet's carbon machinery, as well as an ecosystem. The scale of the Southern Ocean's role became clearer only when observations became good enough to measure it. Scientists now estimate that waters south of roughly 30 degrees south have absorbed a disproportionately large share of the excess heat added to the global ocean by human-caused warming, while also acting as a major sink for carbon dioxide released by human activity. The very circulation that connects Antarctica to the rest of Earth allows changes elsewhere to reach it, and changes here to travel outward again. But the machine is not fixed. Measurements over recent decades have revealed changes in several of its components, although they are not all moving in simple directions. Deep Southern Ocean waters have warmed in many regions. Antarctic bottom water has shown changes in temperature, salinity, and volume, with observations indicating substantial contraction over recent decades, before some more recent signs of partial recovery in particular regions. Scientists are still working to understand how much of that variability comes from winds, sea ice, freshwater input, and changes in the places where dense water forms. The important point is not that the deepest circulation has simply stopped. It is that something once treated as remarkably stable can change on timescales short enough for instruments to record it. At the surface, Antarctic sea ice has provided an equally powerful warning against simple assumptions. For decades, its overall extent showed large year-to-year variability without the long, clear decline seen in the Arctic. Then the pattern changed dramatically. After reaching a record high in 2014, Antarctic sea ice extent fell sharply in subsequent years, and in 2023 it reached extraordinarily low levels, including a record-low winter maximum in the satellite record. The following years continued to show unusual conditions. Scientists are investigating how ocean heat, winds, atmospheric circulation, and feedbacks within the ice-ocean system contributed. What has been observed is the loss itself. Exactly how persistent the new regime will be, and how individual Antarctic ecosystems will respond over coming decades, contains much more uncertainty. That distinction matters, A model projecting future changes in krill habitat is not the same kind of evidence as a satellite measuring today's sea ice. A prediction that some species may shift their distributions as water warms is different from observing a population already moving. The strongest Antarctic science separates those things rather than blending them into one dramatic forecast. Around the continent, however, one connection is already impossible to ignore. Ocean heat can reach floating ice shelves from below. We saw beneath Thwaites that melting depends not simply on whether relatively warm water exists, but on where it travels and how effectively it mixes against the ice. Those interactions matter because floating ice shelves help restrain glaciers behind them. Melting an ice shelf does not directly raise sea level in the same way as melting grounded ice, because the shelf is already floating, but weakening or losing that shelf can allow grounded glacier ice to flow toward the ocean more quickly. The consequences of an ocean current beneath Antarctica can therefore eventually become relevant to coastlines on the opposite side of the planet. Chemistry is changing as well. When seawater absorbs carbon dioxide, part of it reacts with water and alters the carbonate system, lowering pH and reducing the availability of carbonate ions needed by many organisms to build calcium carbonate shells and skeletons. Cold waters can be particularly vulnerable because they naturally hold more dissolved carbon dioxide. How individual Southern Ocean organisms respond varies enormously. Some may tolerate changes better than expected, others face combinations of warming, acidification, and shifting food conditions. Once again, there is no single Antarctic response. There are thousands of species, each carrying a different evolutionary history into a rapidly changing environment. And this is where everything we still do not know becomes impossible to ignore. We have mapped enormous parts of Antarctica from satellites, yet vast areas of the seabed remain poorly sampled biologically. We can describe the anatomy of a half-ton colossal squid, while still lacking confirmed footage of a healthy adult living normally in the deep ocean. We can drill through hundreds of meters of ice and send a robot beneath a glacier, then realize that its journey traced only a narrow line through a cavity extending far beyond its lights. New species continue to emerge from Antarctic collections because finding an animal and understanding the ecosystem it belongs to are completely different achievements. Even some of the physical processes connecting the Southern Ocean to the rest of the planet remain difficult to measure because an ocean this large cannot be continuously observed at every depth. None of this requires hidden civilizations, impossible creatures, or supernatural explanations. The real unknowns are better than that. They exist because Antarctica combines enormous scale with extreme depth, moving ice, darkness, weather, and physical isolation. Science has reached places Cook could never have imagined and still finds itself looking through small windows into something much larger. Which brings us back to the view from where this story began. Seen from above, Antarctica still appears almost simple. A white continent sits at the bottom of the planet, surrounded by dark water. But the dark ring no longer looks empty. Beneath its surface, the Antarctic circumpolar current is moving around the Earth without being stopped by a continent. Deep water is rising from the ocean interior, while some of the coldest and densest water on the planet sinks toward the abyss. Winter sea ice spreads outward, and beneath it juvenile krill search for food among frozen structures filled with microscopic life. Fish swim through seawater cold enough to freeze their body fluids, protected by molecules evolution assembled from ancient genetic material. Icefish move oxygen through nearly transparent blood without functional hemoglobin. Giant sea spiders cross the bottom on legs, surrounding bodies that seem too small to support them. Somewhere farther into the darkness, a colossal squid moves through water in which we have never watched a healthy adult live its ordinary life. Above it, a sperm whale takes one final breath and begins descending toward the same black ocean. Hundreds of kilometers away, a seal carrying a scientific instrument dives beneath sea ice and unknowingly sends measurements back to researchers. Elsewhere, a robot slips through a narrow hole drilled through hundreds of meters of ice and disappears beneath a glacier, its lights becoming our eyes in a place humans cannot follow. And underneath all of them, water keeps moving. That movement began to take its modern form because continents separated millions of years ago. Their separation helped isolate Antarctica and reorganize the ocean around it. Cooling and ice transformed the environment. Life responded through extinction, survival, and extraordinary specialization. Those survivors became parts of ecosystems shaped by sea ice, seasonal sunlight, and pulses of abundance. Humans eventually entered that world, first struggling to cross it, then exploiting it, then measuring it closely enough to discover that the ocean we had treated as Earth's distant edge was connected to almost everything beyond it. That is what makes the Antarctic Ocean far stranger than it first appears. Its strangest features are not separate curiosities scattered around a frozen continent. The current, the ice, the krill, the giants, the hidden seafloor, the whales, and even the water traveling through the abyss belong to the same story. Antarctica became isolated enough to create a world unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. And in doing so, the ocean surrounding it became one of the systems that connects the planet together.